Guys, welcome back. Next up, we've got Adam Rosen, who's the VP of Product and Strategy at Stealthbits, and Dan Blinder, who's the Director of Marketing, who will also be helping out. And they're going to be talking about achieving least privileged access for your structured and unstructured data systems. So, guys, when you're ready, take it away. I hope you all enjoy.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, we can hear you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, everyone. Presentation. My name is Dan Blidner. My counterpart, Adam Rosen, VP of Product Strategy, is going to be our presenter today. But just wanted to hop on, let everyone know that I have the deck that you're about to see in the chat feature. So please feel free to follow along there. But we're going to be presenting achieving least privilege access for your structured data repositories. I'm going to leave the stage and allow Adam the time to present, but I will be following along with the chat, making sure to follow along with the Q&A. So please feel free, and we'll just get started. So with that, Adam, take it away.
Very good. So I'm going to go over a handful of things today, but really the core of the presentation is about achieving a least privilege model across the data sets that are most critical to your organization. So this could be structured data, it could be unstructured data. Probably spend more time on the unstructured than the structured, but at some point I'll open it up for questions, and I can address anything that's on your mind. So really, this is kind of a two-pronged presentation here about some strategies that I could recommend based on my experience working with all different kinds of organizations, and I can show you through the lens of the Stealthbits platform how we address these particular things. But a lot of what I'm going to tell you is general and not necessarily just about using our software. So a little bit about Stealthbits. We've been around for a long time, and really what we believe is important is taking a holistic view at securing your data, and that means considering the credentials that grant access to that data as well as the systems that underlie that data, because there are a lot of exploitable permissions in all of those places. So you've got the data itself and the associated access control list. You've got Active Directory and the different group memberships associated with that access. But going even deeper than that, there are all kinds of security settings that can be misconfigured in AD, and you want to have visibility into where those things can be exploited to gain access to your data. Maybe I don't have access to your account numbers, but I could reset the password of another user who could change a group membership that would in turn grant access to that critical information. So those attack maps are important to keep in mind, and consider the systems themselves in that equation as well. Maybe I don't have access to your critical information just yet, but I can add myself to a security group that'll make me an administrator on the server that has that content, and I can take ownership, give myself rights to that data. So when we talk about systems, credentials, and data, that's what we mean. It's all part of securing the data itself. So just to set the table with some of the terminology that I'm going to use throughout, if you hear me say data access governance, what I'm talking about is the principle of making access to data exclusive, right? That everyone should have the level of privilege they need to do their job, nothing more, nothing less. That's what we call data access governance. There are a handful of things that are typically in the way of achieving that. If you think about the complexity of the entitlement structures, particularly on certain legacy systems like Windows filers and NAS devices and those types of things, it can be rather complex. But also things like SharePoint have 36 different permission levels involved, and databases can be complicated too. So it really applies across the board. That goes hand in hand with excessive access. You've got movers and levers throughout the organization who had rights at one point, probably don't need those rights anymore. People are always very quick to sound the alarm when they need access to something and they don't have it, but how often have you seen someone raise their hand to give access back when they don't need it anymore, right? So that's how those things accumulate over time and result in all kinds of unknown risks and compliance issues. So that's data access governance in a nutshell. I want to talk through the approach that we take to really get all of that under control and achieve least privilege across these different things. So there are 5 phases to it, in summary at least. When we break these things down, there are some nuances to it depending on which platforms you're dealing with, whether it's a database or a file system, collaboration platform like SharePoint or OneDrive or Teams. Everything, of course, works a little bit differently, but these general principles are still applicable. So number one is just discovering what you've got. And I mean that in the broadest sense possible. You want to do host discovery, across your on-prem infrastructure, as well as any systems you have in the cloud, and take inventory of where do you have, maybe S3 buckets in Amazon, and which of the Windows machines on your network might have file shares hanging off of them, probably more than you expect. Where do you have SQL instances? Where do you have databases in the cloud? So all kinds of things like that is starting with that discovery of just knowing the purpose of each machine that you're dealing with. This is an Exchange server, there's a SharePoint farm, there's a SQL server. That's really discovery in the most fundamental level. And then you start to collect and analyze, right? So this is where we bring back relevant data points and start to classify things like what data is sensitive, who has access to that data, how long has it been there, and you can start to prioritize things at this level. But going a step further, it's important to analyze how that content is actually being utilized. So that's where activity monitoring comes into place, and this serves a number of different purposes. But for the sake of proactively achieving a least privilege model, the most important thing we're going to do with this is compare the level of rights granted at present to how these people have behaved in the past. So if you've got a repository where hundreds of people have access and maybe only dozens of people are navigating that repository, maybe 20 people are making changes to files and another 50 people are just reading the files, well, the rest of those folks can be removed without any impact to their day-to-day operations. And that's where restructuring access comes into place. So to achieve least privilege, you can't just simply rip away those people that aren't using their rights. It's usually quite a bit more complicated than that. Some security groups are being shared for other purposes. I'm sure you've seen it where you've got multi-purpose security groups on an access control list, or some people directly assigned, and all kinds of complicated conditions that make it not so trivial just to take someone away, even if they don't belong. So we're going to talk about how to untangle that and really implement the right model that's going to make this better to manage going forward. And then that leads us into the fifth phase, which is governing on an ongoing basis to ensure security and compliance and operational standards. And what I mean by that is you go to the trouble to make sure you've got the right groups on the right access control lists and the right people in the right groups, and that those groups are only controlling those resources, and the people in those groups are only the people that need to have access to that particular thing. Well, that can all fall apart rather quickly if you don't put the governance workflows in place to maintain it going forward. So you want to get the people responsible for that content involved in making those decisions, and figure out who's responsible for what, make them attest to that on an ongoing basis. So monthly or quarterly, you want these folks to perform reviews where they can say, this person doesn't need rights anymore. They've moved on to another department, or they've left the organization, or whatever the case may be. And you want to be able to account for all the exceptions along the way. So that's going to be kind of the core of the presentation. And if we have time, I'll get into some other tangentially related things that I think might be of value. Certainly activity monitoring serves a lot of other purposes, both to have an audit trail to restructure access, but also to proactively stop attacks and abuse of that content. So we could talk a little bit about user behavior analytics if we have time, and responding to those things with playbooks. And then if we have time at the end, I'll talk about data mapping as well, right? If we go to the trouble of finding sensitive content, there are some other benefits along those lines too. But first and foremost, I want to get to the core of what we're here to talk about today, which is achieving least privilege access on whatever types of systems you're working with. So there are three key ingredients to doing this successfully. First is permissions. Understanding existing access rights is really step one of knowing what's over provisioned. And there are a lot of components to existing access rights, as I alluded to earlier, but everything from what's on those ACLs to nesting conditions inside of those groups and so forth. Then the content, you really can't prioritize risk if you don't know what kind of content you're dealing with. So what's sensitive, what's regulated, where do you have information that might be higher priority and have higher security needs than others. It gives you some semblance of where to start. And then, as I mentioned already, activity, right? This is how you know the difference between who's got rights, who's using those rights. So really what you want to do is, you take a tool like Stealthbits that can analyze those access control lists and keep an audit trail and all those other good things, and bring together the differential, right? So if you want to, you can let the platform, audit everything that exists today, see who's inside of those groups and groups inside of those groups, and then compare that to that audit trail. Who's reading, who's writing, who's not using their privileges at all. And that gives you your access transformation, where now we're going to restructure those groups to people who can read and write, and perhaps you want one for administrative purposes, a full control group. And you want to supply a naming convention when you do this transformation. So typically, it's best practice to name these groups after the resources that they're governing. And this will replace any legacy conditions on the access control lists, things like, everyone, domain users, authenticated users, or even just groups that are used for a lot of different purposes, right? You can have a group, third floor, everybody who worked on that floor was in this group, and now we're using it to grant access to things. Quickly becomes, a mess. When you pull that group off the ACL, you're breaking maybe someone's access to an application or something else, and that's exactly what you don't want, what you set out to avoid. So just going through that process really achieves three things: eliminating inadvertent granting or revoking of access, aligning access with least privilege principles, and perhaps most importantly, positioning the resources for actionable governance workflows going forward too. That's what I'm talking about with self-service access requests, entitlement reviews, and keeping the people responsible for that data involved in the process. A lot of you are probably thinking right now, okay, so if we go to a resource-based group model, what about roles, right? Like, I thought we want to have role-based access. And the answer is both, right? Particularly as it pertains to unstructured data. What you want to do is nest those role-based groups inside the resource-based groups. It's going to really give you the best of both worlds. So what I mean by that is maybe today I've got an access control list with an over-permissive group on it. We're going to do that analysis. We're going to figure out which of those people and roles are actually utilizing the access that they're granted via that overly permissive group. And then we're going to apply those new rights, where not only do we put the correct people into the correct resource-based groups, but now we can nest roles into those resource-based groups as well. So I've got an accounting folder, and my accounting admins are going to need right access to that area. And maybe the head of finance is going to need right access to that. But there are going to be some exceptions to that, where somebody from a different department is working on a project and they just need access to this one particular thing. You don't want to give them that entire role. And that's always going to happen with unstructured data. There will never be a scenario with unstructured data where you don't have exceptions. And that's why no matter how you achieve this, I recommend this group structure, where you've got a read group, a read-write group, but nest your role-based groups inside of those resource-based groups. If you just pick one approach or the other, you're going to regret it later on. If you start putting roles directly on those access control lists, you're going to get yourself into trouble. So do it both ways, so you can accommodate both the roles and the exceptions. As far as knowing where to start, this is where we talk about risk prioritization. So who's got access is only one component of risk, right? What kind of data resides in this area? We want to do sensitive data discovery and see where you have regulated and sensitive information, things that would pose a risk to the organization if that content fell into the wrong hands. But it's not just a matter of how much sensitive content is there, who has access to that sensitive data, but also how heavily trafficked is this folder? Is this a SharePoint site open to the entire organization, or a folder that is trafficked frequently, a SharePoint site that everybody's navigating on a daily basis, or some forgotten about folder that maybe has equally inappropriate rights assigned to it, but nobody knows it's there, and only a couple people are traversing it on a daily basis. So those things should all be taken into account when you're determining what data is most at risk. Certainly higher concentration of sensitive data in more exposed areas that are heavier trafficked, they're certainly going to be the highest risk. but it gives you some semblance of priority, you know, in addition to the amount and how sensitive it is and who has access to it. You also want to think about how heavily trafficked those areas are. So then it comes to who ought to be responsible for this content, who should make those decisions, and usually not us, right? You know, within the business, everything belongs to somebody, and it's important to figure out who those people are. So you can put them in charge of making decisions and not only ensure proper security going forward, but maintain an immutable audit trail of who has approved which access decisions and when and why, and you know, a proper justification associated with that. So in this scenario, let's calculate ownership on a resource. This guy, Adam, has created most of the content within this area, right? So he's the owner of all those documents. But then we look deeper and you see George is responsible for 85% of the activity in that area. So we know who's put it there. We know who works with it the most. The other thing we want to pivot on is who do those people report to, right? So if one person made the content, another person uses most of it, and they both report to the same manager, odds are that manager is probably the proper custodian of this data. So that's the path we want to take. And you want to, you know, confirm and verify, meaning emails go out to those suspected owners and they say, yes, this is mine, or no, it's not. So you can do those ownership assignments. And then once we've assigned owners to the different content, you want them to participate in these decisions on an ongoing basis. So we've got this guy, you know, George here, who still has access to the data. He's got full control rights, in fact, but no activity. He hasn't done anything with this data in a long time. Or maybe you've got somebody who's reading but not writing, right? Similar insights to what we use for automated remediation, but now just rolling this up to the person responsible on a regular basis. So I own this content. I get an email that says it's time to review who's got access to your content. And aside from these little hints here, it's mine. I'm familiar with it, right? This is my department or my data repository. I can say, oh, Susan's moved off to another team and Ruthie doesn't work here anymore. So this is giving me the context necessary to make those decisions, and having the right person make those decisions is key, along with, you know, providing any notes associated with why those decisions were made, especially when new rights are granted, right? The next evolution from this is you know, self-service access requests, or you empower the end users to ask for what they want, you know, through a web portal, and they could plug in a note and say, I need this because my job requires X, Y, and Z, or I'm working on a project. Then the person responsible for that repository gets an email, approves it or denies it, again, with the proper justification provided in the notes. So you've always got an audit trail of who's made those decisions. So I think we covered this. I want to talk about databases a little bit. So that everything I told you, it kind of applies to both, but as a little bit more specific with the unstructured content. As it pertains to the databases, there are some different nuances involved, right? Same thing, complex entitlements, unknown risks, excessive access, compliance requirements. But databases, you know, we want to approach it like this. Again, start with discovery, right? Where are there databases throughout your environment? You want to obtain a complete view of your data footprint, so you can collect and analyze the relevant data points to answer critical questions, sensitivity, access, ownership, age, and then same thing, but activity for a database is going to look a little bit different, right? You're collecting queries in this case. So you're talking about things like who's selecting and inserting and you know, things of that nature. So similar conceptually to what we discussed before, but functionally, you know, has its own nuances to it. Remediation, very similar thing, right? People who are not actively accessing or modifying these databases don't need to have rights to do so. If someone is reading from a database but not making changes to it, that's also something to consider as well, but you know, a little bit different than how we deal with the unstructured data. Again, control privilege access to ensure security compliance and operational standards are met. So very similar functionally, but you know, databases have that added complexity where it's not always people accessing the data. You know, these accounts often belong to applications and things like that. So since we have some time left, I also want to talk about data mapping. You know, we were talking about discovering sensitive data. Where do I have sensitive or regulated information? Who has access to it? What are they doing with it? Protecting it from being exfiltrated or abused, and achieving a least privilege model on that. It's a great place to start. But as we pivot, you know, into compliance, there are other ways we could utilize those same capabilities and maybe take it a little bit farther. So security, privacy, kind of two sides of the same coin. I think starting with security is always the right approach. And that's going to facilitate a lot of the things that are necessary for data privacy. So, you know, achieving a least privilege access model is a great start. Having a UBA for breach detection and response is going to help you too. But let's take it a step further into the actual mapping of the data. Instead of thinking about where do I have sensitive information and who has access to it, I want to maintain a map of, you know, not just where is there personally identifiable information, but which documents and which records pertain to which people. So now think about it like this. I've got on the right-hand side here, all these different systems across my enterprise, like we've been talking about, in the cloud, on-prem, in databases, structured, unstructured, collaboration, you name it. Then on the left-hand side of the diagram here, now what I want to do is connect to all these different systems of record and think about things like Salesforce, everybody that I've ever marketed to, and the attributes associated with those people. Maybe my payroll system or my HR platform. This could really be anything you want, right? That's what we mean by any ID. You want to connect to any system of record that you have in the enterprise, and we're going to build a map out of those attributes. So what Stealthbits does is it connects to all these different systems of record, and it combines the attributes discovered there to develop subject profiles. And then we discover those subject profiles across all these different platforms. You know, I got a few examples on the slide. Also, this any data connector, so anything with a REST API is in scope essentially. And connect to those platforms and maintain a map of you know, which records pertain to which individuals. So the effect of that is I want to be able to search for a person like Tom and see where across the enterprise Tom is mentioned, not just his name or his address or his email address or his telephone number, but anything about him, right? Any of his attributes from any of these systems here should trigger a match for Tom. So that's what we accomplish here by approaching the problem this way and maintaining a map on an ongoing basis, right? Every time a record is updated, we keep track of it. And that way, at any time, I could search for a person, get an instant answer, where across my enterprise, across SharePoint, file systems, databases, S3 buckets, whatever the case may be, where is Tom mentioned, right? I need to search for him, and I need to know which files and database records pertain to him, what's been done with that information recently, who has access to it, and perhaps kick off a workflow to put that on restriction or, you know, handle it in some way, whether it's just reporting or actually making it inaccessible or removing it or copying it to another location. So that's what I mean by going beyond just sensitive data discovery and pivoting to full-blown data mapping, right? And taking all the different systems of record that are involved so that you can build out subject profiles of the different people within the enterprise, and make sure you're you know, prepared to respond to those types of inquiries. So those are really the four pillars. When we tie data privacy and data security together, achieving least privilege access is, in my opinion, the most important thing. It's what I would do first, right? You know, especially for a lot of the privacy regulations around the world, achieving a least privilege access model is going to help you in a big way. But, you know, breach detection and response, being able to fulfill data subject access requests, all very important. And of course, fulfilling subject access requests is much simpler if you are maintaining a data map of, again, which records pertain to which people across all the different systems across your enterprise. So with that, I want to open up the floor for questions and address anything in more detail. So tell me what's on your mind.
Hey Adam, thanks. Yeah, I'm monitoring the chat log here. There is one question that we can start with. In a greenfield, how do you begin to evaluate the access mechanisms users need, et cetera, with data dispersal in a hybrid environment? I think you touched on a little bit of that, but if you can go in a little bit more depth.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I think I went over this part kind of quickly before, but whether you're cleaning up an existing environment or starting greenfield, it's all about choosing the right model that is going to be conducive to ongoing governance. So what I mean by the right model is obviously not the picture on the left, but the picture on the right. So I've got an accounting share here. I'm using just traditional file shares as the example. And I've got, accounting people who can read, other group, accounting, read, write, and modify, accounting, full control. So named after, in this case, the server, the share, and the level of access. You can do your naming convention however you want, but consistency is key. So I've chosen to go with these explicit resource-based groups and then nest the roles within. This is applicable to other types of systems as well. So if you're starting greenfield with a new SharePoint farm or some other system, same deal, right? All the more reason to get it right the first time. Yeah, we could run these remediations and clean it up later, but starting with the correct structure in place is absolutely critical. And then we can start to make decisions about who belongs in those groups. And that might take some behavioral monitoring over time, right? Usually that's a problem that accumulates gradually where, day one, I think the accounting team is going to be the only group with access to the accounting folder. But then as people from other business units start requesting access for, I'm working on a project, or I'm doing this, or I'm doing that, you can kind of prevent the problem from occurring by having good governance workflows in place and granting people temporary access, where if you're doing a project for 90 days, your access will expire in 90 days. But even if you don't do that, by maintaining an audit trail is going to help you fix this later on. So I start with the right group structure. I go at this, with the best of intentions, but one way or another, movers and levers and other problems start to result in over permissive access over time. I can always go back and run this again, right? Who's reading, who's writing, who hasn't used their access at all, after that resource has been there for 6 months or 9 months or a year, or whatever the case may be. But starting with the right group structure helps you get it right the first time. And then you could always go back and start to run some automated routines to clean it up once you have some behavioral history to base those decisions on.
Just getting my mic on. Excellent. Thank you very much, Adam. So we have, in fact, there was another question posed just around some of the challenges in terms of assigning AD group ownership. I think that, you even touched a little bit that last explanation. There's another question that came up in the chat. I see this works well for file shares. However, SharePoint doesn't lend itself as well to resource groups. Can you discuss that?
Yeah, so SharePoint has a number of complexities to it. Everything from the number of different permission levels involved to now with SharePoint Online, you've got internal and external sharing, right? So that would be my highest priority thing is, looking for things like external sharing and making sure that doesn't exist in any areas where you've got certain types of sensitive or regulated content. So that would be my first check when I look at SharePoint Online and OneDrive and that type of thing. But I think the question specifically was, does it still lend itself to resource-based groups? And I think in a different way it does, right? But I think it's a little bit more forgiving in terms of you could have a role directly applied in SharePoint and then individually assign people. I think it's less of a problem to individually assign people outside of those roles, directly on the resource in SharePoint than it is on, in something like a file system, right? In file system, I think it's really important to have that resource-based group because it's just too difficult to manage the directly assigned users. Where with SharePoint, it's not as sloppy, right? I think you could have, even though there's all those different permission levels, you could conceivably get away with having a role and then some individuals placed directly, but I wouldn't do that on the file system.
Fantastic. I'm sure I'm just.
And I guess the other thing I'd add there is the file systems like the Windows servers and the NAS devices and those types of things tend to run into the most exceptions, right? People needing access outside of their particular roles, whereas the users are a little bit more agile with these things in a SharePoint environment.
Excellent. Yes. So in addition, there was an interest in kind of going back to the GDPR slide, some of the information around data privacy and that stuff. We are coming close on time.
Yeah.
So if we could just maybe quickly revisit some of the privacy stuff I do want to make sure that we have time to get into some of the next steps items as well.
Yeah, was there a specific question on that?
No, just a request to revisit it. I don't know if we just want to just pull that back up real quick.
Yeah,
in terms
absolutely.
of just those highlights.
Could be any privacy regulation. Someone said GDPR, and certainly, you know, every country has different version of this, right? But some of the basic concepts apply, like when you talk about things like privacy by design, how much time you have for breach detection and response. Those things are going to be pretty standard. I didn't really talk too much about this item here. When I say breach detection and response, I'm talking about being able to detect proactively if something is accessed inappropriately. So using user behavior analytics to catch an exfiltration attempt in flight, or if someone is just behaving suspiciously and looking at content in a way they normally don't, you want to have the investigation facilities to say definitively who looked at this data and when, and ideally catch it proactively if such a thing was inappropriate. But even more proactive than that is just implementing a least privilege model like we've focused on thus far, and then data mapping. I think maybe this is the part you wanted me to go back to, but building a map across the entire enterprise, because you could have data in so many different places. Right now with Azure and Amazon and everything else, you've got databases and collaboration platforms and all kinds of different things where content can exist. When I talk about subject profiles, what I mean is pre-indexing attributes from the different systems of record within your enterprise. So you know every attribute about a person. When I search for Dan, I don't just want to see files that have his name or have his address or whatever. I want to see files that have any of Dan's attributes from the different systems that I'm connected to. So data mapping is the practice of maintaining a map of where these subject profiles exist across all these different systems in your enterprise, so that when you get asked a question, you give a complete answer. Where do we have records pertaining to Tom? There are 2,435 places where we make mention of Tom, and that's inclusive of all the different systems in our enterprise, and we could attest to the fact that it's accurate. We can put that data on restriction if needed for compliance purposes.
It is really interesting to consider one of the compliance responses that we've had at one of the larger US-based financial institutions was around an individual's Christmas cards, because they contained, you know, address and personal information. So, you know, I think that's a really, really interesting point. Adam, just because we are running tight on time, can we just jump over to the next step slide very quickly? I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank the AusCERT2020 team putting all this together, as well as our partners, EMT Technology Distribution, excuse me. They are our local presence in your part of the world. Adam and I are presenting from the East Coast right now. So with this, you know, there are some amazing resources available to you from Stealthbits and EMT, whether it be our credential and data security assessment to try and understand, you know, really, you know, what is the issues that you're running into today, whether they be low lift fix or really, you know, much larger projects. It's a great way to just kind of level set and understand in terms of these critical aspects of your environment where you stand with your credential and data security. We also have a remote workforce security center as we're doing this conference in this virtual space. The world has definitely changed quite a bit, and so we have this resource available to everyone as well. And then finally, for any of those of you within the healthcare industry and vertical, we do have a specific EPHI security assessment. So again, it's a little bit more specific sensitive data discovery and management effort around EPHI. So, but that really is the presentation for today. I don't see anything else in terms of questions, so I think we can wrap. But Adam, any closing remarks?
No, thanks everyone for attending. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. It's been great chatting with all of you, and look forward to working with some of you in the future. You know where to find us.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.